from the east, New York to be specific. In fact, so many of the early pioneers emigrated from New England and New York that the Northwest Territory became known as the Yankee Empire. Ohio was the first stop on our journey to Michigan. At age 14, I was sent to my grandparents to live in Calhoun County, Michigan. Soon after, my father, mother, and 7 brothers and sisters followed. Then, in 1856, we ended up just down the road in Paw Paw in Lawrence. My father, Eva Rowland's trade was as a miller. I was trained as a miller as well, but had had the good fortune in my youth to be attending school more often than many, and so I was considered to be better educated than most. So at age 19, I was able to secure a teaching position. Soon, I would marry my sweetheart, Mary Benjamin. Sometime thereafter, we would have 2 daughters and 1 son. But in 1861, the rains came down just like they are today. In 1861, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, and I enlisted in Company C of the 3rd Michigan Cavalry. We left Grand Rapids and headed for Missouri. And when we got to Missouri, we headed up the Tennessee River to Shiloh. After the Battle of Shiloh, we returned to Missouri and we were assigned to the Western Army under our great General Ulysses S. Grant. Often we were in the saddle night and day. After the Battle of Corinth, Missouri, we followed and harassed the retreating rebel army for 75 miles, capturing many prisoners. The 3rd Regiment was used as scouts for the Union Army, and as such, we were in constant engagement with the enemy. While our duty was very hazardous, it was vital for the war effort. We would see service in 10 different states, covering more territory and marching more miles than any other Michigan regiment. In 1865, I was discharged with the rank of captain, having been promoted up through the ranks. I would return then home to Lawrence. To support my family, I worked for my father in the mill, and I resumed my teaching position. Next, I would, 3 years later, I ran for and was elected to my first term as the county clerk. I would see service for 55 years in many different capacities with the Van Buren County in the courthouse, as well as 8 years as Justice of the Peace. We had moved to Paw Paw, and I, of course, began to study law and eventually passed it. I had other interests as well. In 1882, I became part owner and editor of the True Northern. After 6 years, I sold my interest and launched the Decatur Republican. I was editor, owner, and publisher. My interest in education led me to serve 25 years on the Paw Paw Board of Education, several as president. My ultimate goal was to raise the level of standard education for the district. My interest in history led me to take on the challenge of editing the 2-volume History of Van Buren County, published in 1912. It had been some 80 years since the first settlements were laid here in Van Buren County, and there were none of the early pioneers left to tell the story. So, I used information from the 1880 history of Berrien and Van Buren counties to begin. I also interviewed and corresponded with friends and many of the older residents. I was able to use my knowledge of public records as a source of information, knowledge that was not readily available to other scholars. But I am told that my knowledge and my work has been a valuable asset to many scholars, as well as to those who have an interest in genealogical research. I am proud and pleased to know that after my passing in 1923, the headline for my obituary was Dean of the County Courthouse claimed by death. I had the distinction of holding more offices than any other man in county history. It was also said that I was a foremost figure in the history of Paw Paw, identified for my interests in civic, educational, fraternal, religious, county, and state activities. But most of all, I am humbly gratified to know that I have left an indelible impression upon the institutions and the people whom I have loved and served so well. I thank you for coming to visit Prospect Hill Cemetery today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit.
Let me introduce myself. I'm Wade Kilfer. This here is my brother Bill. In case you can't tell, we're baseball players. We started playing in about 1897 when a man named John O'Leary came to Paw Paw. Thanks to Coach O'Leary, I played on the first state championship high school team for Paw Paw in 1902. Bill's team here won it again in 1905.
I'll bet very few of you know much about the early days of baseball. Well, Wade and I have good parts to play in that, and we'd like to share a few stories with you.
That's right. So we started playing in what's called the dead ball era. They called it the dead ball era because we only used one ball the entire game. So as you can imagine, by the end of the game, that ball was pretty much useless. It was all lumpy and lopsided and stained dark from all the dirt and mud and tobacco juice.
What a mess. Until Babe Ruth started the home run era in 1920, baseball is an inside game. It was played between the lines. It was dominated by the pitcher. Pitchers used a variety of techniques to change the trajectory of the ball. You guys heard spitballs, right? They also would use their fingernails to cut the ball, so when the ball came in, it would move. Home runs were very rare. It was a game of singles, bunts, and stolen bases.
Yep, then in 1920, the baseball was upgraded and standardized. They started making things like spitters and cut balls illegal. Old Babe, for one, he took full advantage of those rules, and the game of baseball has changed forever.
Again, until this time, in the early days we were playing, we didn't get paid a lot. So we switched teams often. We went wherever the money was. However, the major league owners had instituted a reserve clause, whereby if you played in the major leagues, you couldn't change teams without the permission of the owner.
That's right. So my career began in fall of 1906 when I got drafted by the Detroit Tigers. Then in the spring of 07, I was sent to Johnstown, PA to play for the Johnnies, which was the farm club at the time. Later on that season, I was called up to play my first major league game against the Chicago team.
Yeah, I was being passed around in the Texas leagues between Houston and Austin. When a scout from the St. Louis Browns found me in 1909. In 1910, I reported the Browns training.
Oh yeah, I remember. They said you were long on pep and short on silence.
Yeah, come on, give me a break. They also said I was quick but smart. I was young, promising, and very ambitious. In fact, I was so quick on my feet, they nicknamed me Ranger.
He was pretty fast, I'll give you that. Then in 1910, Bill and I got to play our first game against each other in the major leagues. I was playing for the Washington Senators, and he had just started with the Browns. But by the end of that season, the Senators said they wanted to take a look at some younger players. Well, I was only 25 years old at the time, but that's the way it was. So after that season ended, they sent me home on salary.
Yeah, I remember you at home and you married, who was it, that Wizard of Oz girl?
Wizard of Oz. Her name was Dorothy Gale Park. So you know she was in Paw Paw, not in Kansas. Anyways, let's get back to baseball. So in 1911, the Senators sold my contract to Minneapolis Miller to the American Baseball Association. We ended up winning the pennant that year and again in 1912. By 1914, I had 4 major league teams bidding on my services again.
Yeah, at the old age of 30, this old man here, he was playing outfield for the Cincinnati Reds and batted .312, 4th in the National League. Pretty good for an old guy, huh?
Yeah, but by 1916, I was getting a little tired, so I told the Sporting News I was thinking about retiring and moving out west to California. Well, then a man named Frank Chance, who was the manager of the Pacific Coast League team, the Los Angeles Angels, he talked me into signing on for that season. But before that year ended, poor Frank got ill and had to retire, so I was offered my first job as manager.
Yeah, in those days, it wasn't uncommon to be a player, coach, and manager all on the same team. Oh, I forgot to mention something. Wade here, he was nicknamed Red because he had brilliant red hair and his face is red most of the time. But one time he got so upset with the Angels the way they were playing that he put all the names in a hat and the first 9 he drew started that game. Another time against Seattle, he went out and picked up and shook the umpire because he didn't like the way he was calling balls and strikes.
Yeah, that guy had it coming. Well, hey, let's talk about you for a minute. So Bill, in 1911, he got the chance to play for a man named George Stallings. George sent him through an educational course on how to become a finished backstop. A backstop is what we called a catcher back in those days. Well, after that, the Philadelphia Phillies bought his contract. They put him in to start for none other than Grover Cleveland Alexander, one of the greatest pitchers of all time. In fact, that first game against the New York Giants, I believe it was, I'll never forget that, turned out to be the first of 250 games that Bill would be the catcher for Grover Alexander. In fact, he even said after his career was over that Bill was the best catcher he ever had the chance to work with.
Yeah, we had quite a string there. In 1913,
When they made a movie about you
well,
guys.
yeah, I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
But in 1913, they started keeping stats on the number of throwouts to second base. I led the league with 130 guys that I had caught stealing. In fact, they made a movie about us. It's called The Winning Team. Ronald Reagan played Grover Cleveland Alexander. Doris Day played his wife Amy, and I was played by George Milligan.
Nobody knows who George Milligan is.
Yeah, but that's not the point, Wade. I was in the movie. Were you in the movie? No. Get back to me and Grover. In 1915, we started a 3-year period where we had 30-game winning seasons those 3 years, and Grover had 12 shutouts. Quite a feat.
Yeah, that was pretty good. But then, in 1917, the baseball world was stunned when the Phillies decided to trade Brother Bill and Alex to the Cubs for 2 players and $55,000 cash. That made it the biggest trade in baseball history at the time. In fact, the Chicago Tribune wrote about that trade and they said Kilfer is unquestionably the best catcher in the National League, and he makes all his pitchers look better than they are. In fact, they said the Cubs should be more proud of the fact that they obtained Kilfer than his more famous teammate, Alexander.
Yeah, what we do in the World Series next,
Right? Well, the National League pennant.
Well, we won the pennant. All right.
Well,
close to a World Series.
yeah.
We're getting there. Unfortunately, when the United States entered World War I, I got drafted. I never saw any active duty. I spent a year mustering men out of the service, and as soon as I mustered out, I reported right back to the Chicago Cubs. In 1921, I was named manager of the Cubs. I was the youngest manager in the major leagues. I played my last game of baseball in the major leagues on October 1, 1922. But I wasn't finished with baseball. No way. I stayed with the Cubs as manager until 1925 when I went to the St. Louis Cardinals. I went to St. Louis. I bounced around so many places I can't remember, but I went to the Cardinals. And in
forget that one.
I know. In 1926, we beat the Yankees for the World Series championship.
Right.
Pretty good. A few years later, I went across town to the St. Louis Browns on a 3-year contract.
Now that one was a little more forgettable. I remember you called them the hapless Harriers. In fact, the Yankees beat you guys 21 times in a row. Remember that? Then they called it an insult when you guys finally won the 22nd time.
Yeah. Well, Phil Ball, who was the owner of the Hapless Aries grounds, he would do all these behind-the-scenes trades, getting rid of some of my better players. I couldn't put a good team on the field, but I wouldn't quit, no way. They actually had to fire me. It wasn't outfit.
So in 1927, I played my last game with the Seattle Indians. They put me in as a relief pitcher. I actually threw a shutout inning that day. And I could finally say I played all 9 positions out on the field. The year after that, the Pacific Coast League team, the Mission Bells out of San Francisco, they hired me on as their manager.
Yeah, they paid him $20,000. He was the highest paid minor league manager.
Right?
Yeah.
Remember my nickname?
Yeah.
We started calling the team then?
The team. They gave him the nickname of the Radiant Red because of Wade's red hair and of course he was covered.
That's right. They renamed the team after.
They did.
Yeah. Then a few years later, I was back in the majors. The Indianapolis Indians offered me a job as manager. So I stayed on with the Indians for 5 years. But I kind of missed California. I pretty much made it my home. I owned a ranch out there in Hermosa Beach, and I wanted to get back to the Pacific Coast League. So the Mission Bells had relocated from San Francisco down to Los Angeles by that time, and they offered me the job as manager and business director. They were calling themselves the Hollywood Stars. So I took that job and moved back out west. In fact, when we got there, we didn't even have a stadium of our own. So I had to broker a deal with the Los Angeles Angels, who were the farm team of the Cubs at the time. They had just built this beautiful stadium out there called the $1 Million Palace. William Wrigley Jr. put it the bill for that one. So we paid him $17,000 to clear that field. We also didn't have a whole lot of money for players back in those days either. Remember Jimmy Crandall?
Yeah.
I had to purchase him I purchased him from the Indians for a case of gin, 2 crates of limes for my orchard, and $1 cash. We had to get a little creative.
It was creative there. In 1935, Grant Rickey, who was the manager of the Cardinals, sent me out west to make a deal for the Sacramento Solons to become part of the Cardinals farm system. When I got there, what a mess.
That team was bankrupt.
Yeah, that team has been repossessed by 2 local banks. I had to work out a deal with the Pacific Coast League just to keep the team going while I went out and found new talent.
Yeah. Well, we were supposed to play. Well, yeah, despite all that, it was a couple years later, you guys were already in first place.
Yeah, we moved in first place. In the mid May, I think it was 1937, my Solons, I was manager, went against Wade's Stars in the last week-long series. And the last game of the series was set on brotherly love day. Well, unfortunately, it was anything but that. The next day, the Sporting News ran this headline: "The Battling Kilfer Brothers."
Yeah, that was a fun one. My pitcher got thrown out for arguing balls and strikes. I came charging out on the field to defend him with the rest of the team right behind me. Man, we were not about to leave the field.
Yeah, the fans really got into it. They started throwing soup cushions. Bottles began to fly. They had to call in the riot just to safely get the umpires off the field.
Oh yeah. Well, needless to say, we lost the game out on forfeit. I also got fined $1,000. That wasn't the last time we played each other.
That's right, we played each other a few more times. In 1940, around there, Wade was back.
I was back with the Indians, right?
Managing the Indians, and I was with the Milwaukee Brewers.
That's right.
Yep.
But I eventually decided to hang it up after 35 years in organized baseball in 1941. I had retired. I moved back out west.
Yep.
And well, I'll let you tell them then.
Well, what happened was, it was great. In 1945, after World War II got over, Wade was inducted into the Pacific Coast League Hall of Fame as both a player and a manager. Really a great accolade to his great career.
You still had a little.
I had a few years,
left, right?
left. In 1946, who was the new owner? Bill Beck. Yeah, he was the owner of the Cleveland Indians.
Yeah.
He sent me out to scout in the Negro League to find talent. I found Larry Dolby, who played 13 years in the major leagues and was a well-known black player, one of the earlier black players. And in 1968, he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. I also found Jose Santiago and Vinny Minoso for the Indians. My last year in organized baseball was 1948.
Well, I think we kept you guys out in the rain long enough, but we really appreciate you letting us Paw Paw guys reminisce a bit. Hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about baseball history. Thank you guys.
Good afternoon. My name is Clara Anderson Rennie, and I was the first librarian in Paw Paw at their new Carnegie Library in 1920. I'll never forget that day. It was so amazing. I walked in and smelled the new buildings, the books. I looked around and saw everything so neatly organized. And I just felt so proud. I was proud to be the librarian, but I was also so proud of my community for coming together and making this dream come true. And I was proud of the Coterie Club because they were the ones that got the ball rolling and they really made it happen. It was a wonderful day. But I'm here to talk about my life story. And that's just a part of it. My story begins with my maternal grandparents, Dolphin and Nancy Morris. They came from Ohio, from a small town, and they came to Michigan. Well, my grandfather, Morris, and his brother Samuel, and two other friends came to Michigan to claim some land. They found a piece of land in Cass County, and they built a cabin and staked the claim. And then they went back to Ohio to get the family. So when they returned to Michigan, they found that someone had dumped the claim. So they had to find another piece of property. And they found one in Van Buren County. And they became the first pioneer family in Van Buren County in 1832. And Michigan wasn't even a state then until 1837. My paternal grandparents were LeGrand and Catherine Anderson. And they also came from Ohio, from a town very near where the Morrises came from. They came to Michigan and claimed a plot of land of 500 acres in Decatur. And that's where I was born, on that 500 acres, in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War. My parents were Susanna and LeGrand Anderson. And I had an older sister, Mary Grace, everyone called her Grace, and a younger brother, LeGrand, named after his father and grandfather. But unfortunately, my brother died at the age of 7. I had 3 tragedies in my life, although I had a lot of happiness in my life too. But the first tragedy occurred when I was 3. I was too young to know what was going on at that time. But my mother died of consumption. Today that's called tuberculosis. And my father decided that I would go live with my Aunt Mary and Uncle Benjamin Murdoch. They lived at 212 Elm Street in Paw Paw. It wasn't until I was a little older that I found out this was really a very worthy arrangement for everyone involved. My Aunt Mary and Uncle Benjamin had 2 children who both died in infancy, and so they were thrilled to have a chance to raise 2 children, Grayson and myself. So my Uncle Benjamin was a very learned man. He had a college education, and he was a teacher. He taught for 12 years, and then he decided to leave his position as a teacher and study medicine. And Uncle Benjamin became a druggist, which he did for a while, but he was not in good health, and he had to leave that position earlier than he would have liked to. My Aunt Mary was also a very intelligent woman, and she had been educated by John Purdue, who established Purdue University. That was when she was still lived in Ohio before she came to Michigan. She was also a teacher, but when she married Uncle Benjamin, she had to leave her teaching position because at that time women could not stay in their teaching positions once they married. So, Grace and I had a very pleasant upbringing with Aunt Mary and Uncle Benjamin. They always encouraged learning. There were always lots of books, and they developed a love of learning in myself. And Grace, I suppose, too. I had another tragedy, my second tragedy of my life. It occurred when I was 12 years old. My Aunt Esther and Uncle Charles Morris, who lived in Decatur on a large piece of land, they were murdered in their home. I don't know if you've heard of the Morris murders, but it was a senseless, horrible thing that happened to them. The assailants broke into their home and murdered them at night. But even though Aunt Esther and Uncle Charles were quite wealthy, nothing was taken from the home. And there was apparently no reason for the murder. The only witness they had was a neighbor, who said he saw a man riding a horse wearing a funny hat. And that's all they had to go on. They couldn't identify the man because of the funny hat. The horse was found in South Bend, Indiana, but the assailant was never found. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired to solve the crime, but they were never able to do so. And it's still not solved to this day. Well, I was quite stricken with this murder of my aunt and uncle, and I realized the fragility of life and how fortunate I was in the situation I was in with my aunt and uncle. And so I poured myself into my studies at Paw Paw High School, and I graduated in 1884. And my Aunt Mary and Uncle Benjamin encouraged me to go to Erie College in Ohio, which I did. Pardon me, my nose is running. So I went off with their blessing to Erie College, where I got a 4-year degree in liberal arts. And I'd like to say that my college years were the wonderful years that they usually are for young people. But at that time, a woman getting a 4-year education was uncommon. And I was often reminded that some people thought I shouldn't be there. But I managed anyway, and I got my degree. I moved back home to Paw Paw to live again with Uncle Benjamin and Miss Baker. And that was in 1887. And I met my husband, James Cat Rennie, shortly after returning home to Paw Paw. Now, James had come from Scotland, and he came to the United States to get a degree in Missouri. And when he got his degree, he went back to Scotland for a brief time. And then he came back to New York City, in fact, to get a theology degree. And he came to Paw Paw to be a of the Presbyterian Church, but he only held the position for 1 year, and then he went back. Well, I'm not sure where he went, but he left Paw Paw. And he returned 2 years later because he had decided that he fell in love with tiny, friendly Paw Paw, and he wanted to live here and make it his home. So we met and fell in love. We got married in 1899 in the parlor of my aunt's house and my uncle. And, well, I'd just like to read you this passage from the True Northerner, the newspaper at the time. And it must have been a slow news day because we made the front page of the paper when we got married. The reporter said that it was a beautiful and impressive wedding held in the parlor of her Aunt Mrs. Benjamin E. Murdoch. Clara, as described, was one of the most highly cultured and popular young ladies of the town. And James is described as having won the esteem and confidence of all our people as minister of the Presbyterian Church. He was quite generous with that reporting. James and I had a wonderful marriage. We were very happy together, but we were never able to have children, and that was unfortunate. We were married for 14 years. In that 14 years, James developed a disease called ataxia. That's a disease that affects the cerebellum, which controls muscle movement. And so James needed lots of help in his daily activities, and I became his helper. Well, while I was caring for James, my aunt and uncle both developed pneumonia. So I had my hands full for a while there. And my uncle, Benjamin, did not survive his pneumonia. My aunt did, though. And I was happy for that. A few years after my uncle passed, my husband, James, died at just 41 years of age. But I carried on, and I decided that now I had some time I could give to my community and do more for them. I inherited quite a fortune. It was very comfortable for me, and with that fortune I was able to travel, and I went to Europe. I caught a ship out of Canada called the Empress of France, and I toured Europe for 3 months. It was wonderful. I kept notes, and I came back to the community, and anyone that would listen, I would tell them all about my adventures in Europe. Well, at this time, my father was, well, he was prone to getting in some trouble. And at one time he had 4 lawsuits. Either he was suing someone or they were suing him. And he was keeping me busy, helping him out with his legal problems and resulting money that he owed people. I don't know if you've heard of a breach of promise. Well, my father was accused of a breach of promise. He promised to marry a woman, and before the wedding, he left suddenly, moved to Colorado, and so she sued him for breach of promise. Anyway, getting back to my community activities. I decided to join the Coterie Club, which was just for me. The Coterie Club was originally called the Ladies Literary Association, which had literary readings and social gatherings. But the Coterie Club decided to expand their endeavors and do more for the community. Some might say that we meddled, but we tried to do anything we could to make our community a wonderful place to live. When I joined Coterie, I met Florence Harvey, who you'll meet right up the hill. Florence and I were fast friends. We had so much in common. We both collected jewelry and cameos in particular. And we loved gardening, we loved reading, we just liked to spend time together. Unfortunately, Florence was also a widow and childless. So Florence and I decided that the library was going to be our legacy. And Florence was going to be the first librarian. She went to library school and prepared for the position, but then illness kept her from becoming the first librarian. So the Coterie and Florence herself all decided that I should be the first librarian, and I was so honored and humbled by that. So I took part in, I was the librarian for 16 years, and I loved every minute of it. I decided after 16 years it was time for me to turn the duties over to Rena Van Possen, who became the second librarian, and she was also a Coterie Club member, a founding mother at the club. With my time, I also decided to join many clubs. I joined the Daughters of the American Revolution. I was in the Baby Reading Club. I was also secretary-treasurer of the John O'Leary Scholarship Fund, and that's a fund that awarded $100 to a worthy Paw Paw High School senior. Usually a woman, sometimes a man, but that was very near and dear to my heart because I was able to help a young woman further her education with that scholarship. I also had a coin collection that was my pride and joy. I had a special case made for it in my parlor at 212 Elm Street. And I had a 1776 banknote with it, and I had coins and banknotes for every century, the last 2 centuries. And I was asked to go to Washington and share my collection with the United States Treasury Department, which I did willingly because I was thrilled to be able to go to Washington and share that. And I had many other exciting, and I also sewed, and I did whatever I could for the war effort, World War I. I helped with the Red Cross and donated 2,000 hours of time helping them. So as you can see, my life was spent giving to my community. In my obituary, it was mentioned that I was a friend to all and always willing to serve others. And I like to hope that's true. I lived a life with some tragedy, but mostly happiness. And I was very honored to be the first librarian of the Paw Paw District Library. And I'm so happy to see that the library is still enjoyed by the community because you're all here to hear about my life story. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the tour. You'll see my friend Morris soon.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out today, especially a blustery day like today. It shows some real Paw Paw grit to be out in the weather like this. I'm Edward Harvey, and this is my wonderful wife, Florence Godfrey Harvey. And I don't know about you, Mrs. Harvey, but when I look at this stone up here, I always get a little bit of a chill. We're going to talk a little bit about our lives today, and I live the life of service. So I hope what I have to say is interesting to you, and maybe will even inspire you to do your own service in your own communities, wherever they may be. My family came to America in 1836 and settled in Madison County, New York. I was born in 1845. About 7 years later, in 1852, my family decided to go west. Well, back then, Michigan was the West. So we took the Erie Canal, which some of you may remember, and met a big lake, ended up in Detroit, took an ox cart on the Territorial Trail, and settled in Richland, north of Kalamazoo. I was raised like most kids were back in those days. I was always an avid reader. And the next big thing that happened in my life was the Civil War began in 1861. The following year, I enlisted at the age of 17, and I became a member of Company A in the Michigan 7th Cavalry. We saw some skirmishes, and in March of '63, we got a new leader. George Armstrong Custer became the Brigadier General of the Michigan 7th Cavalry. Now you may remember Custer. He was a bit of a flamboyant, some might say controversial figure throughout his life. He designed his own uniform. Long blue, lots of brass buttons. He always wore leather riding gloves. He wore his hair long. He had blonde curls, which was not very common back in those days. And his hat always had a beautiful feather. Well, some people thought Custer was a bit of a dandy. But Custer said he wore that outfit so his men could see him on the field. And I can tell you that we could always see Custer on the field. And he always led from the front. He was a very, very brave general. Later in 1864, March, as the war was dragging on, Lincoln summoned Grant to Washington, D.C. Lincoln wanted the war to end. It was also an election year, and he wanted a big victory. Well, Grant came up with a plan called the Overland Campaign. Essentially, a bunch of flanking maneuvers to destroy Lee's army and capture Richmond. This is Virginia, of course. Well, the battle began on May 5th of 1864. And on May 28th of that year is when my luck ran at a battle called Hawes Shop. We met a cavalry force under a Confederate general named George Hampton, and Custer ordered us to dismount and meet the enemy on foot. Custer rode ahead on horse as he usually did, with his hat waving us forward. And about 4 p.m. that day, a mini ball shattered my right leg. It was such a grievous wound that my leg had to be amputated right then and there on the field. I was sent on a boat to Washington, D.C. to a hospital. It took about 2 days to get there. Now, the Overland Campaign was one of the bloodiest in American history. 55,000 Northern troops fell and 33,000 Confederates. When you hear those numbers, you would think that the North must have lost the battle, but in reality, the South was running out of replacements. It couldn't replace the men they were losing. And this was the beginning of the end of the Confederate Army. Well, I recuperated in D.C. for 6 months, and it was there that I got my artificial leg. I want to talk about the leg because I had it for 50 years. And during the war, there were so many lost limbs that doctors and inventors were doing their best to create new artificial limbs. So I did not have a peg leg like you might have imagined years before. My
Well, after I was discharged from the Army, I went back to our home in Richland and decided to become a minister and enrolled in the Prairie Seminary in Richland. Now, some would say that what I saw in the war probably led me in that direction. I think that's partly true. After 2 years there, I transferred to Kalamazoo College, graduated, went for 2 more years at McCormick Seminary in Chicago, and the idea again seemed like a lot of education, but received another 2 years at the Union Seminary in Columbia College in New York. After 8 years of schooling, I was a minister and began my career in Summit, New Jersey. But I always wanted to get back to Michigan. A few years later, I became the minister at the Presbyterian Church in Albion. In 1878, my brother Henry and sister Alice and I decided to go on a grand tour of Europe. We had a wonderful trip, saw all the sites, the capital cities, and I highly recommend it if you're going. Wonderful. When I came back in 1881, I became the minister in Augusta, while getting closer to Paw Paw. But the most important thing that happened to me in that year was I met and married my wonderful wife, Florence Godfrey Harvey. I was 15 years her senior. And we settled in Augusta. We did our best to improve the community. Well, a few years later, we went on our own trip to Europe. We had a wonderful time. And when we came back, we settled in Paw Paw. And we thought our lives were settled down for good. We thought we would be staying in Paw Paw and doing our best to help the community. But in 1890, President Benjamin Harrison appointed me a pension agent, and we moved to Detroit. Now, during the Civil War, 2.5 million men wore the Union colors. And I took the job of making sure that those veterans and families received the benefits that they were due. It became a mission, and I took it very seriously. In 1894, we came back to Paw Paw, and we lived in a small house on Kalamazoo Street. And we did our best to take care of the flock and help the community the best we could.
At the Presbyterian Church.
Yes, yes. And you know the church. It's a tall, white steepled church, very active still today. Beautiful church. You should take a look at it if you don't know where that is. And we did our best to help the community all that we could. We were members of lots of lodges and community organizations. But I always dreamed of having a grand house. And Mrs. Harvey's going to talk more about the house. But I'll just say my favorite part of the house was the library, because I was a bit of a book collector. Well, the last part of my life, the last calling I had, if I say, was for political office. But I never won an election. I was a candidate, but never won an election. And looking back, it may have been a blessing. Not sure, but it was okay. I died in Paw Paw in the house on November 9th, 1916. And that was the end of my life in Paw Paw. Lauren, share with folks about your life.
Thank you, dearest. And yes, you shouldn't say the rest of your leg of that. As Edwin said, I am Florence Godfrey Harvey, and I was born April 13, 1860, on my family's farm, the Godfrey Farm, near Battle Creek. There were 8 children, but my parents were very much in belief that girls and boys should both be educated. And so we were educated at home, reading the Bible and other books and literature that my parents felt was appropriate. About the time of my 18th birthday, Edward and I met through mutual family friends, and in 1881, at my 18th birthday, about that time, my father approved Edward as the suitor, and we began our courtship. In 1881, we were married in the Presbyterian Church, and I was 21, he was 36, much more worldly and educated than I, but we were going to have a good life together. We lived in Augusta for 3 years, and then moved Then in 1884, he surprised me with a grand tour of Europe. And I was very excited to see all the architecture and the monuments and the art there. And I knew that he was going to be an extraordinary guide because he'd been there before. In 1890, we were in Paw Paw, and I and several other like-minded women began the Coterie Club. And I believe that you heard my friend Clara Anderson-Rennie talk a little bit about that. Shortly after that, we became a pension agent and we moved to Detroit. We had a good life in Detroit, went to lots of events and social gatherings, but the one that is the most memorable is an event at the home of Robert Wagner. Not the Robert Wagner that has to do with Natalie Wood. This Robert Wagner was a very famous artist in the Detroit area. His home was very great. Exquisite architecture and furnishings, and was so elegant that we fell in love with it. And we promised to ourselves that we would have a grand home as well. So, in 1894, we returned to Paw Paw and moved into a small house on North Kalamazoo Street, very near the Presbyterian Church where Edward was minister. He talked about his brother Henry being a Presbyterian minister, but Henry in 1892 gave up the ministry and purchased 140 acres of land east of the town and decided to devote his activity and his energy to farming. So Edward purchased 40 acres from his brother with the idea that that would be where we would finally build our home, the home of our dreams. We finally began construction in 1902. It took 2 years to build the house. And the gentleman that Edward hired, we had a carpenter by the name of William Simmons and a painter by the name of John Taylor. Edward would take the wagon and horses into town every morning, pick them up, drive them to the site. They would work all day, and then they would walk home to their dinner in the evening. They were paid $2 a day.
Highway robber.
Was it $2 each a day? Or
$2 each.
$2 each a day. The house had 5 bedrooms and 3.5 baths. But my favorite room was the music room, and it was on the 2nd floor. And the lower floor was all oak from Michigan. The music room was outfitted with Mexican mahogany. And in addition to that, it had a wonderful mural of harps and violins and flutes and other musical instruments, highlighting my interest in music and also my talent as a musician. Edward's library, which he talked a little bit about, was also on the 2nd floor, and it was on the front of the house. And if you drive past the house, you see that there are double doors that open onto a small balcony, and that's where the library is located. We lived there together for 12 years. We did a lot of traveling during that time. One of those things where we went was the Chautauqua Institute in Chautauqua, New York. It was a gathering of thinkers, philosophers, educators, faith leaders, inventors, lots of open minds that were there, and we participated in that more than once. And that institute still exists and happens annually, even today. So we lived at that house together for 12 years. And Edward passed away in 1916. And as a widow, I wanted to make sure that I remained active in the civic life of the community. But being that he was a book lover and I was a book lover too, I felt that we needed to have an honest, official library in the town of Paw Paw. So I proposed to the village council that we should do that. And in early April of 1917, they approved our writing a grant proposal to Andrew Carnegie for one of the Carnegie Library grants. A week later, on April 12th, 1917, the day before my birthday, we got notice that Mr. Carnegie had given us $10,000 to build our library, with the stipulation that we would build the library on a site and have tax revenues of at least 10% of that grant, or $1,000 a year, to maintain the library. Well, the members of the Coterie Club were very supportive of this, and one of the other Coterie Club members, Caroline Sillick, was concerned that we get the best site possible, and so she personally donated $3,000 to ensure that we got a good plot of land for the library to be built. In 1919, construction began, but was stopped because of the start of what we called the Great War, and what you refer to as World War I. So when construction resumed a year or so later, costs had increased a little bit. And so we went back to the village council and said they were able to secure $4,500 in additional funds, and construction continued. Because I wanted to make sure that that library was a good library and was well run, I enrolled in a course at the University of Michigan in library science. I also hired a specialist to catalog all of Edward's books. There were about 2,000 of them. And I plan to be the first librarian in the Paw Paw Library. However, in 1920, when the library finally opened, I was not well enough to assume that position. And my friend that you met, Clara Anderson Rennie, stepped in and took charge. I continued to live in the house for another 25 years and had lots of gatherings. Many of them were focused on encouraging, especially young women, to be involved in the arts and literature and civic activities. But in 1940, I was still alive and heard FDR announce the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the start of World War II. I didn't live to see the end of World War II. I died at the age of 86 in 1943, and my home still stands on the Red Arrow Highway. Do you have anything to add, Edward?
I would just add to please remember to take a look at the house sometime, and also don't forget the Carnegie Library downtown Paw Paw. It's a wonderful building. Thank you for
Lorraine. My name is Emery Briggs, and I was born in 1820.
Hello, I am Romanzo Mortimer Buck. I was born in 1833 in the state of New York.
We have a few tales to tell you about early Pawville here today. To begin with, my brother Dwayne and I left Lewis County for Michigan in 1839. We decided to go through Canada rather than take a steamboat from Buffalo to Detroit. But unfortunately, when we got into Canada, we were immediately arrested. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Patriot War in Canada, but there were a group of Canadians decided to try and overthrow British rule of the province known as Upper Canada. Unfortunately for us, there were also 100 Americans or so who were involved in this insurrection. And so the British were kind of suspicious of Americans coming across the border, even though the war had ended the year before. So I think you, down earlier here, you met Olin Rollins, and he talked about editing the history of Van Buren County. If you can find that book in the light, it is in the library. There's a chapter in it, an account of our travel across Canada, which is named The Dangerous Briggs Brothers. So, anyway, common sense prevailed, and after a lengthy interrogation and a search of our property, the commandant of the Queenstown Post let us travel on our way. Our trip across Canada was long and tedious, but we eventually made it to the township, Paw Paw Township, which in 1839 was called Lafayette Township, actually at that time. We invested in 40 acres of land, which we registered in our father's, Alan's, name. I made a living as a teacher and as a surveyor, surveying roads and town, properties in the local townships. And after about 25 years, I became involved in local politics. I bought the Paw Paw Free Press, and I built the flour mill on the pond, which till today is still called Briggs Pond. In 1865, I was on the board of directors for the First National Bank. And in 1868 and 69, I was elected to the office of village president. But let's go back to 1867 for just a minute. I was cashier at the bank here in Paw Paw, the First National Bank. But the bank did not have its own building. It was actually in the back of the tall brick built store, which was a hardware store owned by my good friend Alonzo Buck.
Hold on, before we talk much more about the bank, let's back up a little bit, because you know in the early 1860s there was a little fight called the Civil War. Well, in 1862 I decided to enlist, and so I joined the 4th Michigan Cavalry at the age of 29 under the command of Colonel Robert H.G. Minty. And in September of 62, we left the area, headed down to Louisville, Kentucky, and then got on our horses and took off in search of the enemy. Well, in no time at all, we encountered in the town of Stanford, Kentucky, John Hunt Morgan and the Morgan Raiders. It was our first taste of battle, and we were victorious. Well, in 1863, John Hunt Morgan began a 1,000-mile campaign through Northern Territory, burning bridges, destroying railroads, stealing municipal stockpiles of weapons. Well, we finally caught up to him in Salineville, Ohio, and at this point he only had 400 cavalrymen of his original 2,000. So we captured him, put an end to the Morgan Raiders, and he was sent to the state penitentiary. But I'll be doggone, that bugger managed to escape even the state penitentiary. Well, between this time, we were continuously engaged in battle, not only with Morgan, but with other units as well. In fact, in May of 1863, we did battle with the 1st Alabama Cavalry, and we captured their flag, which was a huge trophy. So we sent it to Lansing. It was presented to our esteemed Governor Austin Blair, and it was placed in the state rotunda, and it stayed there until 1941, when it was returned to Alabama. In 1864, we joined with Sherman on his march to the sea, and we were south of Atlanta during the siege, and at one point we got completely surrounded. We were outnumbered 5-1, but Minty managed to get us out of that scrape and secure his command. Well, after the fall of Atlanta, we were given mostly just scouting duty, where we were continually going out and engaged with many Confederate armies. We fought many times against Generals Joseph Wheeler and also Nathan Bedford Forrest. And we went through parts of Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. In fact, in early '65, we were in Macon, Georgia, when we got word that Robert E. Lee had surrendered. Well, rumor was that at that point, Jefferson Davis was trying to escape the Confederacy and make his way to the Atlantic coast. So, Minty went to Pritchard, our lieutenant colonel, who was from Antwerp, and said, take 150 of your best men and go out and see if you can't capture Jefferson Davis. I was one of those 150. Well, we were trying to find out his whereabouts. Most of the citizens would not help us, but we did manage to find a few that were loyal to the Union, and they told us that there was a wagon train that they had seen coming through heading towards Irwinville, Georgia. So we took off. Well, early that next morning, we found an encampment. And so we were surrounding it, and we noticed 3 women hastily trying to remove themselves from the camp. So George Munger from Schoolcraft, who was a corporal, and James Bullard, also a corporal from Paw Paw, quickly went out and stopped those 3 and said, "Where are you going?" And one was kind of hunched over at a shaw, and they were, pressing them for information, and the one lady says, "Please, this is my mother-in-law. Let her pass. We're going to get water." And the lady did have a bucket, but Munger and Bullard happened to notice that the mother-in-law had on boots and spurs. So they were, "Are you Jefferson Davis?" Well, at that point, Pritchard rode up and got close to this person, and he removed his shawl, dropped the bucket, straightened up. He was blind in one eye, looked up and said, "Are you in charge of this command?" And Pritchard said, "Yes, I am." And he says, "I am indeed Jefferson Davis." Well, at that point, fighting started. Bullets were flying. We were under attack. So we started return fire. It was the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry that were firing upon us, thinking that we were the enemy, and we were returning fire in kind, thinking that they were. Well, Pritchard figured out what was going on, rode up between them and yelling, "Stop, stop, stop. We are all Union here." So the fighting stopped, and the war at that point was over, and we were mustered out. Now, the rumors were that Jefferson Davis had a lot of gold with him when he was trying to escape. But Munger, Bullard, and myself all testified that we never knew anything about any gold. I did buy a hardware store when I returned to Paw Paw. But the one thing that was very frustrating was there was a huge reward offered by the government for the capture of Jefferson Davis. So it was ours. Well, first Wisconsin said, well, we were helpful in this, the ones that were firing upon us. We guarded the road, so we should get a share, and all these other units, well, we should get a share as well. And that pie kept getting cut smaller, smaller, and smaller. Well, what was left for the 4th Michigan Cavalry was pretty small, and our leader, Pritchard, kept it all for himself. So I was very frustrated in the fact that I didn't get this money that was rightfully owed me. And that, sadly, brings me back to my good friend Mr. Briggs and the bank.
I was in charge of the vault in the bank, and there was $50,000 in cash stored in the vault, in the back of Buck's hardware store. One morning I came in, and there was $20,000 missing. And much to my dismay, I asked the Pinkerton agency in Chicago to send someone to investigate. They sent an agent undercover as an insurance agent. And the investigation lasted about a year, and then the money was discovered on the property, buried on the Buck family property over in Keeler.
Well, the jig was up. My brother and I confessed that, yes, we had indeed taken the money and buried it on the farm. And I was sent to the state penitentiary for 2 years. Upon my release, I decided that from that moment on, I was going to be an exemplary citizen. So I came back to Paw Paw. I was an insurance agent for a while. I became the village constable, and I was even once considered for the prestigious office of village clerk.
We'd like to thank you all for coming this afternoon and to hear our tales of adventures and daring do in early Paw Paw. Thank you.
Yay, that was good.
Welcome everyone to beautiful Prospect Hill Cemetery. My name is Isaac Watts Willard, and I started this cemetery back in 1859 on these 32 acres of land. This place holds a special place in my heart because I wanted to build a cemetery worthy of the citizens of Paw Paw. So I spent the last 20 years of my life beautifying these grounds. But I get ahead of myself. I was born on December 1st of 1803 in Worcester County, Massachusetts. My family soon moved to Vermont, and by the age of 21, I had my own business in Rochester. I first visited Michigan in 1827 at the age of 24. Did you know that when Horace Greeley said, "Go west, young man," he meant Michigan? That was as far west as the territories went in those days. I visited Niles, Marshall, Battle Creek, and Kalamazoo along the Territorial Road. I ended up in White Pigeon, which was a major distribution hub in those days because that's where the land office was. I opened a business there with John S. Berry, who you'll remember as the 4th governor of Michigan. We had accounts for Willard and Berry in several surrounding counties. Unfortunately, not all of my business prospects were a success, and our business dissolved in 1831 when I moved from White Pigeon to Kalamazoo, which was then called Bronson. In 1834, the land office also moved to Bronson. The village grew leaps and bounds, and I knew that there was opportunity, so I opened Willard's Mercantile. In 1836, Bronson changed its name to Kalamazoo, which I can tell you old Titus was not too happy about. Kalamazoo soon had all the services necessary for a growing metropolis. I became its first postmaster, which I ran from the back of my shop until the first post office was built. The land office in Kalamazoo was so busy that it was forced to temporarily close. You see, land offices sell land patents, which is the first bill of sale of public land. Land was sold for $1.25 an acre back then, which definitely helped with the popularity. By 1839, I owned 2,240 acres in Kalamazoo and Van Buren County, as well as some surrounding areas. A lot of things were happening in Michigan in 1836. We had fulfilled all the requirements necessary to apply for statehood. I was sent as a delegate for the Democratic Party at the age of 36 when Governor Stevens Mason called for a Congress of Assent. We met and the votes were evenly split, and you'll be not surprised to learn that no sort of agreement could be found between the two parties. You see, the main point of contention was the Toledo Strip, which both Michigan and Ohio vied for, because the Maumee River held such massive inland shipping opportunities. President Jackson wanted Ohio's 21 electoral college votes to go to his successor, Martin Van Buren. So Congress came up with a compromise. If Michigan dropped its claim to the Toledo Strip, it could gain the 3/4 of the Upper Peninsula. This was not too popular, though, because the Upper Peninsula was an isolated wilderness with no financial prospects, full of nothing but Indians and fur traders. If Michigan didn't achieve statehood by the beginning of 1837, it would forfeit a $400,000 government loan. Governor Mason quickly called for a second Congress of Assent, where he sent new delegates, mostly Democrats this time. We met in December of 1836 in what was called the Frostbitten Convention, both because of the cold reception to dropping the Toledo Strip and the frigid Michigan weather. With less than a month to our deadline, we finally achieved statehood. In 1838, Peter Gremps and Lyman Daniels platted the original 51 blocks of Paw Paw. 10 years later, I platted an additional 66 lots along the Territorial Road, which you now call Red Arrow. I had business prospects in Paw Paw when I finally settled there in 1840. I partnered with Peter Gremps in a sawmill that he owned, and I set up a grist mill on the same site. In 1840, I built 2 flatboats to ship the flour from my grist mill. See, even then, the Paw Paw River was a crooked and shallow river. It took twice as long by boat than it did the 36 miles by land. Our sawmill and grist mill is marked by a historical marker along the Paw Paw River behind Tapper Chevrolet. By 1848, plank road mania was in effect in Michigan. We thought that paving roads with wooden planks could help improve travel. I became commissioner of the Paw Paw and Lawton Plank Road Company because, remember, I owned a sawmill. We charged 2 cents a mile for vehicles and 1 cent a mile for a horse and rider. We completed the only plank road finished in Van Buren County, which was out of commission in the next 5 years. I was named as the timber agent for Michigan by President Pierce. You see, no new settlements could be built without the necessary timber. In 1859, at the age of 56, I was named village president of Paw Paw. I decided to build a new cemetery right where you are standing. It was the greatest passion of my life, but I didn't undertake this project alone. I had my faithful dog, Cato, named after the Roman senator known for his conservative viewpoints. I was called eccentric, but I lived my life on my terms. One of my fondest passions was stargazing, so I built a 127-foot tall tower, the highest elevation around, with the best telescope. You could see my tower for miles, and from the top, on a clear day, you could see straight to Lake Michigan. Unfortunately, I was not known for my carpentry skills, and my tower started to lean like the Leaning Tower of Pisa after a strong wind blew through. I was not too happy when people started calling it Willard's Folly. It was still standing here. 20 years later, in 1879, when I was buried near its base. Unfortunately, a tornado came through a few years later and my tower came crashing down. And this is where my story ends, here in beautiful Prospect Hill Cemetery in scenic Paw Paw, Michigan. I hope you've gained a better understanding and a greater appreciation for this cemetery. If you'd like to see my monument, you can follow this path marked by arrows, or you're welcome to wander the cemetery. When you're ready to go back to the Lions Club, you can take the trolley, but don't dally too long because the last trolley leaves at 5 p.m. Thank you so much for coming to visit, and I hope you come back soon.